The medieval times, the European Dark Ages, if you will, the European Middle Ages, whatever you want to call it, it's just a setting that the public imagination just can't seem to shake for the life of it. I mean, how could you? A ton of people portray the setting like it's unruly or something like that, but nobody's saying that it wasn't freaking cool. Seeing that we live in a post-colonial world, the driving influence of feudal Europe and its aesthetics is England. But how long has England been doing the kings and bishops thing, and what were the first kingdoms of England? Well, that will be the subject of today's episode of Origins of England, the country's early development as it figured out its identity. This is episode 3, by the way. And in order for you to fully grasp this monumental transition and really wrap that little head around what I'm putting down here, you need to learn about the island of Britain's Roman legacy and the violent but largely undocumented mass migration of the Anglo-Saxons and their interaction with the natives. Oh, would you look at that? That's what episodes 1 and 2 are about. Please go give them a watch. The segment of English history we'll be starting is called the Anglo-Saxon period, or sometimes referred to as the Heptarchy period. It began in roughly the late 400s with the foggy establishment of the first royal lineages and ended roughly when William the Conqueror and the Norman army took over the country in 1066. Anglo-Saxon England certainly never had plated armor or walled castles or anything like that, and was quite different from what the country would become by the time English knights were stomping around the Middle East and making a name for the country. For a good long time, it was considered that proper English history began with William in 1066, when medieval culture and civilization in the way that we imagine it was brought from the mainland and the real nobility was installed. Beforehand, it was backwater and barbaric, a relic of the migration period and not impactful with its history and legacy. This is far from the truth, and I find the misty years on the island when everybody was named Cuthbert or something to be fascinating. They were certainly not completely scattered and uncivilized, as the tireless work from both Anglo-Saxonists and archaeologists have uncovered that some of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms at the height of their power had enough central framework to almost fall under the modern definition of statehood. So today we will talk about the emergence of Heptarchy and the first couple big boys on the block. Without further ado, this is the H&H Show. I'm your host, Russ Snow, and this is the Origins of England, Part 3. Alright, so just to get this started, why is it called the Heptarchy? Well, hept means 7, and this era was defined by the shifting power and influence of 7 major kingdoms who rose to the messiness of post-Roman Britain. You got Northumbria in the north, Mercia in the middle, East Anglia in the southeast, Essex in the far southeast, Kent at the bottom of the southeast, and Wessex in the southwest. Now, I would absolutely love to tell you the exact scenarios of the founding of each kingdom and what each founding ruler liked to have for breakfast. But getting more than a vague outline of when the Anglo-Saxons established themselves is a tall order. Within English history, between the 400s and the 600s is formally considered the lost centuries. There's no conclusive contemporary source that survives from them, and the best that we could do is use archaeology and draw indirect conclusions from the 2 shaky sources that we got. So let's break down those 2 sources. First, we got On the Ruin of Britain from approximately the 540s, so sort of contemporary, written by a Brittonic church scholar named Gildas. And the second, we got Ecclesiastical History by Bede, written in 731. So while useful, is a bit down the road. And we'll take a moment to formally introduce Bede. Throughout the first bit of Anglo-Saxon history, Bede is the most heavily used source, and we sure sure we'll be hearing from him frequently. He was a monk from Yorke that lived between 673 and 735 and was probably a genius and was definitely ahead of his time. He has a huge list of works like Ecclesiastical History, Greater Chronicle, On Time, and many more. This guy is single-handedly one of the main reasons we know what little we do know about the development of the Anglo-Saxons. Anyways, Gildas wrote on the ruin of Britain as a allegorical tale and relies quite a bit on literary tropes and also a good amount of religious knuckle smacking. Its primary purpose was to reprimand the Brittonic people for what Gildas perceived as sinful behavior, and to use the sinful behavior of his fellow churchmen as a reason for their continued loss to the invading Anglo-Saxons. However, while the specifics and accuracy of the events in the book are uncertain, it still remains an incredibly important piece of survived history, as it provides a great general overview of the events and sentiments of the day. Also, on the ruin of Britain is partly where the legend of King Arthur was born, as Gildas recounts an event where a Romano-British general named Ambrosius Aurelianus halted the Saxon invasion by crushing them at the Battle of Mount Badon in 506. With this heroic achievement, the Romano-British held on to enough sovereignty for Gildas to write his book as an independent people. But alas, the cruel mistress of history deemed that the Saxon tide was inevitable. And reading Gildas's fiery words will tell you it was already starting to lap up on old boy's feet. But what exactly was this Saxon menace, you ask? Well, using the words of Gildas as well as some supplementary facts from Bede, we could get the general outline of the waking moments of 3 of the 7 Heptarchy kingdoms. After the Western Roman Empire left Britain in the 400s, Brittonic power brokers increasingly relied on Saxon mercenaries to fight out their squabbles. At some point between 449 and 456, 2 prominent Saxon warlords, Hengist and Horsa, knew of an opportunity when they saw it, and began to demand ridiculously high extra payments from the British kings, who could not pay them, in which the Saxons would retaliate by marauding and plundering their land. After staunch resistance by a British king named Vortigern, the Saxons decided to go hard or go home and invited their kinsmen from the mainland to migrate, as it was now a full-blown revolt with the intention of conquest. They began to dominate most of the areas of post-Roman Britain, and after a quick breather from a good old-fashioned King Arthur beatdown, they resurged and took most of the south. Where's your King Arthur now, huh? Is he gonna come pull the sword out the stone? I don't see no stone. Where's your Roman boy? Where's your Roman boy in his robes? Where's his robes? Seriously, where was that guy's robes? Wasn't he like a general? Like, what was he wearing? He was a Celt, right? He was a Celtic guy, right? Maybe some tattoos or something? Like, I thought maybe he'd have some tattoos. That guy was dressed weird. He was like dressed like us, but like in the future. It kind of freaked me out. This 5th century tale of the Saxon revolt, paired with some archaeological evidence, is concluded to be the origins of the southern kingdoms of Essex, Sussex, and Wessex. Germanic this and Germanic that. But do we have any specifics about which Germanic people came from the mainland and what kingdoms they went on to form? Well, we actually do, as Bede was a pretty stellar anthropologist and was clearly working with some sources that we no longer have. The Heptarchy's ancestry was composed in majority by 3 groups: the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. The Saxons were a tribe located on the western coast of the Danish peninsula and were the active party in the 5th century rebellion, as mentioned. The Angles were a tribe located just southeast of the Saxons and had historically close ties to them. Said Angles came a bit later in the 6th century and began to occupy the lands in the north, formulating into the kingdoms of East Anglia, Mercia, and Northumbria. With the preservation of some annals from the 13th century, we also know that the ruling families of the Anglian kingdoms had a fair amount of Swedish input as well. Kent in the far south is a bit of an odd man out. with its origins being traced almost exclusively to a people called the Jutes, who lived in the Jutland Peninsula and Denmark as well. Most likely they were closely related to the other two main parties, both linguistically and culturally, so not much was lost in translation. But this individualistic heritage was a source enough of pride for the knowledge of it to be rigorously preserved. So hey, there you go. Bede provides some other peoples that had a significant presence on the island, like the Franks and the Huns, funnily enough. But yeah, mainly those three. Man, one way or another, Denmark is so involved in this island's affairs. The Britons were stressing about big, brutish guys from Denmark storming in, and then they did. Then a few hundred years later, the Danes that woke up late were like, weren't we supposed to pillage Britain? Dog, weren't we supposed to pillage Britain or something? And then they took a few swigs of mead and got on their longboats, and here they come again. If anyone from Denmark is watching this, put the coffee and canned fish down for a moment and give it another try. Third time's the charm, you know? In the popular imagination, these mainland invaders took over Britain right away with little delay, and I feel like in my last couple episodes I sort of played into that. However, most likely the first good chunk of the lost centuries were about warring with the Britons, and it was all a much more gradual process. Important Saxon cultural and logistical power centers weren't captured from the Britons until the late 6th century, particularly the Thames Valley at some point in the 500s, and the cities of Gloucester, Cirencester, and Bath by Cuthwine and Cuthwolf in 577. Fascinating names. Kingdoms of Romano-Brits are confirmed to exist deep into the 7th century, and when that element couldn't find a space for them, they merged with their Welsh brethren that occupied a good swath of the west of the island until like the 12th century or something. So it wasn't all horrible for Team King Arthur, just mostly horrible. But how are these migrants so dominant in the end? Well, let's take a look at the checkpoints in the life of an Anglo-Saxon male. Upon very first opening his eyes, this is what little Cowain Burt had to look forward to. At 8 years old, if he was a peasant, he started working. Pretty cut and dry. Welcome to life, kids. Suck it up. But at least he isn't a noble. Well, wait. Aren't nobles supposed to have it easy? Well, at 8, noble boys started learning how to use the sword in battle. By 15, Prince Charming was in the field in the weekly dynastic purge or invasion from neighbors and absolutely swinging for his life. Lord have mercy. And get this, if a nobleman was somehow able to survive more than a week, he got to retire to a monastery at the ripe old age of 25. The average lifespan for the whole population was like 30, and everyone had to know how to fight. Long story short, these people did not mess around. Speaking of the ins and outs of the average Anglo-Saxon life, let's take a moment to discuss that. The most common living situation throughout the period was centered around the timber hall, large communal living centers about 50 square meters that could accommodate 10 to 15 people. There was typically a big hearth in the hall center, and everyone lived amongst each other, save for a section that was closed off for the ladies to dress and whatnot. Civil structure revolved around that of the farmstead, a timber hall for people to live, 3 to 4 buildings for storage and other purposes, and a field of crops. The average community consisted of 3 to 10 farmsteads and the respective accommodations loosely clumped together, and maybe some sort of meeting structure for the heads of each community to problem solve and talk business. The demographic of people per farmstead would usually be a couple, their 4 children on average, a grandparent or an uncle or two, and a handful of slaves and their freedmen counterparts that stuck around. An archaeological example of this, if you want to give it a look, is the East Anglian village of Westow that had about 4 to 5 farmsteads and was active between the 5th and 7th centuries. An interesting fact about Anglo-Saxon life is that there was no separate housing for the slaves or anything. They lived in the same building under the same roof as the masters. You know, it would probably be pretty hard to maintain a cruel streak as the head of a farmstead because, you know, the slave you just mistreated could do you in as you put your shirt on in the morning. The lost centuries Anglo-Saxons took a nosedive from the level of their Roman predecessors concerning architecture and civil engineering. There's no doubt about that. But it's unfair to consider them primitive. Most notably, early Anglo-Saxon metalwork is stunning and arguably better than the metalwork of the Romans. But yeah, it was certainly a nosedive in those other departments though. In the ex-Roman town of Verulamium, a water pipe that was laid in the 400s was discovered. It is significant because it is the only known example of civil engineering that could be dated to the lost centuries. Which is like, come on guys. It can't just be songs about elves and pretty helmets all the time. You gotta dot your I's and cross your T's sometimes. However, by the early 600s, organization became less spread out and slightly more modeled on the Roman past. And by then, you're finally reaching the first kings that appear in the history books. Mr. Ethelbert of Kent, it is so nice to meet you. Say, sir, how does it feel to be the first Anglo-Saxon king to make it into the history books with just, like a bit of credibility and details about their life, I think I probably died a long time ago. He's not going to answer that. Ethelbert of Kent lived between 560 and 616 and is a monumental figure in English history for a couple of reasons. For one, he's the earliest surviving example of one of the Bretwalda or Greater Kings. A king who had his own kingdom but also held some sort of authority over the other kings of the Heptarchy. Bede in ecclesiastical history refers to Canterbury, the kingdom's capital city, as Ethelbert's metropolis, so there's a decent chance that the Kentish king and his predecessors maintained some form of urban life. What gave the Kingdom of Kent the first jump on centralization and cultural growth was its geography. Kent had ownership of the best port on the island and with it the ability to lord over all trade and exchange between Britain and mainland Europe. The kingdom therefore became the wealthy and worldly kid on the block. Many foreign goods are found in the cemeteries of 6th and 7th century Kent, and Kentish craftsmanship is found abroad as it was considered good stuff. The kingdom lost its status as a power center pretty quickly, but it never really lost its status as the cultural center of the South. It even maintained its individualistic identity and infrastructure when future overlords moved more towards the practice of absorption. However, none of this compares to Kent's biggest contribution to the history of England as one of the starting points for English Christianity. In 560, King Charibert of Paris wanted a marriage alliance with the kingdom and sent off his daughter to marry Ethelbert. As she stepped onto the ship, I'm sure she signed a cross on her chest to request safe travels. Meanwhile, Ethelbert was juggling fire sticks and balancing on a unicycle and endlessly screaming at the top of his lungs. Because, that's what the god Woden required for a good week. But, as I'm sure you could tell, he decided to kind of take it easy on the rituals that week. As secretly, he was beginning to have doubts. Okay, so, his bride arrives, and Princess Ingoberga, as a Frank, is a staunch Christian. So staunch, in fact, that upon arriving to her new home, she demanded that the old Roman church be restored. She wanted a place that she could worship. Ethelbert said, well, happy wife, happy life, and so then he approved the restoration. While he didn't convert right then, it definitely introduced him to the concept of Christianity. So when St. Augustine embarked on a mission to convert the English in 597, Ethelbert nearly immediately converted and allowed Augustine to set up shop in Canterbury. Augustine and his missionaries operated out of the kingdom and were able to convert a significant number of commoners there, as well as the royal family of Essex. While there were a couple lapses back into paganism here and there, by 655, Penda of Mercia, the last great pagan king, died in battle. In 50 years, Christianity completely swept through the nation. For the next few centuries, Canterbury would remain as the center of Latin Christianity in England, and where the archbishop of the country would be stationed. But hey, did you catch that? Key word there, Latin Christianity. The traditional medieval European church operating under the authority of the Pope wasn't the only crowd running around and preaching the word and signing up little Ingo Bella Wellica and Coetha up for Sunday school. There was also the Celtic Church. You see, by the time the Roman Empire fell, its citizens were thoroughly Christian, and this includes the British Isles. But as the Britons were overrun by the Anglo-Saxon invaders, they inherited the pagan religion of their new overlords. But Christianity spread from Roman Britain into Ireland, and Ireland was never overrun by anybody up to that point. So their isolated church and practice survived, a relic of the old days. Shortly after the Frankish princess arrived in Kent, a young Northumbrian noble by the name of Oswald was exiled during the usual dynastic struggle to the Celtic kingdom of Dalriada in 616. While there, he rubbed shoulders with the locals and was converted by some Irish monks into Celtic Christianity. Oswald ended up winning the game of Super Exile Brothers and became the king of Northumbria. By that point, he was a devout Christian and wanted his people to follow suit. So in 634, he requested a missionary from the monastery of Iona. They asked around, and the Irish monks were mostly appalled at the prospect of having to hang around the English for a day. But this sort of thing is bigger than that sort of thing, so they sent a monk named Aidan, who ended up becoming a saint. And you don't usually get the title of saint in the church world if you're bad at your job. And by golly, Aidan was good at his job, as by the end of his work, most of the Northumbria peasantry had converted, partly through Northumbria's menacing secular influence, which we'll get to later, as well as the rigorous work of Aidan and other Irish churchmen. In 635, the kingdom of Wessex had converted. Then Essex, a bit later in 653, which you'll recall must have lapsed back into paganism after being converted by the Latin Church. And then finally Middle Anglia as well. So Christianity was collapsing on the nation of England from two different sides at the same time, from two unique entities working independently of each other. The establishment of the Latin Church was operating out of the Kingdom of Kent, and the various Celtic missionary entities were operating out of Northumbria. Well, if you're a man of faith, that's good news, right? I'm sure the respective church leaders on either side were just glad that the good word was coming out of two sets of mouths, not just one. The monks probably held really nice picnics. One side brought corned beef and cabbage, and the other side brought hummus and pita bread, and maybe even a few olives. I'm sure it was lovely. Except no. If you know about the history of any major religious establishment, you know that that's not how that went. Of course, the two sides butted heads on a number of things. And following the initial sweep of Christianity over the country, this big rift prevented the church from entrenching itself any further. This initial divide and then eventual merge is a subject that's way above my pay grade, seeing that I'm not a theologist or a church historian. But to keep the show on the road, the basic gist is this. The Latin Church was organized and efficient, but highly bureaucratic and politicized, whereas the Celtic Church was rigorous and pious, but had no central authority or official hierarchy. The Latin Church's problem with the Celtic Church is that they saw it as sloppy. As I said, there was no central leadership, just a web of churches and monasteries that communed with each other but had no proper administration. It also, of course, irked the Latins something fierce that the Celts did not recognize papal supremacy, meaning they did not officially recognize the Pope as God's vice-regent on earth. They believed that with Celtic Christianity's lack of unity and competent management, it would easily be the victim of attacks on the faith and secular exploitation. Meanwhile, the Celtic Church promoted humility overall and believed they preserved the nature of the religion in its truest form in a couple of different ways. Firstly, philosophically. Celtic churchmen focused on separation from the material world and focused their labors on conversion of the pagans and tending to the sick and poor. Secondly, in a literal sense, modifications made to things such as the calculation of Easter and other dates never made it all the way to Ireland, and the Irish holy days were preserved from the Roman past. These changes offended the Irish, as these dates were supposed to be sacred. All in all, they found the Latin church to be too corrupt and married to the world of man. Why should I even cook you my locally renowned cabbage and potato stew if you just are gonna take bribes? No way, not happening. That is why it was such a big deal when King Oswy of Northumbria hosted the Synod of Whitby in 664 for the two sides to hash it out. Bishop Coleman of Lindisfarne represented the Celtic side, and soon to be Bishop of York Wilfrid represented the Latin side. Both sides got to say their arguments, and in an interesting case of the state meddling in religious affairs, King Oswy actually got the final say. The king ruled in favor of the Latin Rite, surely influenced by the idea of potential political ties to the rest of Europe. And it was now up to Bishop Coleman to go with the flow or not. The bishop realized the Latins had a point about survivability without a support system, and the Church of Northumbria swore fealty to the Pope. A domino effect occurred, and soon the rest of the Celtic churches followed, and thus the two great bodies were officially one, and the culture of Christianity could mature amongst the English people. With King Oswy now able to attend a papal picnic and not be afraid to invite his Irish buddies, he requested a new Archbishop of England from Pope Vitalian in 667, as the last one had passed away. But when Pope Vitalian asked around, the first guy was like, all the way up in England? That's so far. No way. And the second guy was like, England? How dangerous. No way. I'm sorry. No way. England? How dangerous. Ugh. No way. I'm gonna have to say no to that. And the third was like, England? No, I heard the food is terrible. I'm gonna have to say no, man. And then the Pope had a bit of a problem on his hands. The Pope couldn't get any immediate candidates to agree to the archbishopric, as the job was seen as unsafe and exotic. However, the Pope finally got a yes from a monk named Theodore, who was a relatively last-ditch pick. Theodore of Sarsis was an ethnic Greek about 60 years of age and a refugee from Byzantine Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey. As a victim of the explosive early Islamic conquest by the Umayyad Caliphate, he was a stern man who was educated in Constantinople and took pride in his heritage and the sophistication his Eastern background granted him. Theodore saw the guiding of the English as his calling and would become one of the country's most important historical figures if you think about it. When Theodore arrived in the city of Canterbury in 669, he at least had a solid base to work from. Kent was already thoroughly Christianized. Paganism had been outlawed for years, and there were numerous churches as well as relics of saints. However, when touring the rest of the kingdoms, he realized he had a lot of work to do. Yes, indeed, all of the major royal lines had converted, but there were only 4 bishops for the entire country, and their consecration was shaky at best. Matter of fact, when Theodore investigated the Bishop of London, he found out the guy purchased his position. Dude just strolled up to the king and was like, let me get a pack of, Marlboro Reds, that scratch ticket right there, the red one, $4 on, pump 10, pump 5, and, y'all got the bishopric? Okay, and I'll take the bishopric too. And then the king was like, all right, boss, that'll be $49.95. Theodore got rid of him. From now on, everybody had to follow the proper process and be legitimate in their appointments. Now, what about the commoners, like the common people? Well, Theodore banned paganism outright across the entire nation. But Theodore himself said that pagan worship amongst the commoners was very scarce. Their conversion was genuine. Rather, due to the lack of church organization, or really many churches at all, Christian belief among the commoners existed inside the rituals of old pagan custom. For example, the English word for Easter comes from the name of the pagan goddess Yorke, who had a feast around the same time of year that Easter takes place. Archbishop Theodore's 21-year tenure marked a turning point for England. Theodore organized the first council of English bishops to be recorded on a notary, taught his pupils official canon law, enforced written and archived synods, and fathered the scholarly practice within the church that directly led to the creation of most of the sources used to study the Anglo-Saxon period. Theodore then died in 690 AD, probably more influential in the trajectory of England than any king we'll talk about today. Theodore is a real source of Byzantine pride. I mean, he's Roman pride. Roman pride, sorry. And with that, the church and England are officially wed, at least until Martin Luther comes along. I decided to get all the major religious history for the period out of the way in one section, but I don't know if you've noticed, but we've kind of jumped ahead. So let's roll it back a bit to break down England's first truly dominant kingdom, Northumbria. Northumbria quite literally just means north of the Humber. And as you guessed it, it's the big one on the north of the island. If Northumbria was a person, they'd be mixed, having an Anglo-Saxon parent and a Celtic parent, with the kingdom having Germanic language and practices, but Celtic culture and intellectual heritage. Genetically, Northumbria maintained the most native Brittonic blood amongst its people, and has always had close ties with the Scottish and Irish spears. Northumbria is a fan favorite, with its artsy libraries and vague aesthetic of a lush green and stormy breeze, and started its rise to nationwide prominence in 616 with King Edwin, according to Bede. But about Northumbria, especially the early years, not much survives to tell us what happened. Save for church matters, most of the Northumbrian period can only be gathered from what birthday cards and trinkets did make it. This is going to be a recurring theme for Anglo-Saxon history, as I'm sure you could already tell. And here in a little bit, we'll see just how little we actually know. Anglo-Saxon politics was defined by which king and which kingdom held the role as Bretwalda, or greater king. The degree of a Bretwalda's control over the other kingdoms is a subject of great debate. Up until our beloved church scholars' day, Bede lists off the Bretwaldas that have held the title so far. And this is where we get a grasp on how little we know. All right, so in my script, I have the list right here. So, Aule of Sussex from the early to late 400s. We don't know anything about that dude. Colwyn of Wessex from 560 to 591. I read the book. They don't know anything about that guy. If they did know about it, they would have mentioned it. Ethelbert of Kent from 591 to 616. Okay, we actually know quite a bit about that guy. He was in the last chapter. He featured himself as one of the main characters, so things are getting better, I guess, you know. Redwald of East Anglia from 616 to 627. Who on earth is that? Who is that? And then we get the start of the Northumbrian Bretwaldas, who hit a nice three-piece, with Edwin ruling from 616 to 632, Oswald ruling from 634 to 642, and Oswy ruling from 642 to 670. After the death of our mysterious Redwald in 627, no southern or eastern kingdoms held the title ever again. Coastal ports and mainland contact fell out of the meta. Get with the times, Kent. Your prime was nice when you had it. Instead, in the early 7th century, power started to shift over to the frontier kingdoms, Wessex, Mercia, and Northumbria. What I mean is that they were on the frontiers of the Welsh and Old British world, the Celtic kingdoms that made up the west of the island. At first, it sucked to watch Kent and Sussex sip Italian wine and talk about how soft Chinese silk is. Meanwhile, Welsh kingdoms are sending their first round draft pick to blow up your farmstead every other week. But chin up, Cowainbort. It's a long-term investment. Trust. As those posh kingdoms down south had nowhere to expand. Meanwhile, when the Welsh and Britons started squabbling amongst themselves, the frontier kingdoms were right there to swoop in and nab up more and more chunks of land. This constant potential of growth of capital that did not have the political baggage of destroying and consolidating a fellow kingdom of the Heptarchy made it so that there was a new A-team in town, and stodgy old Kent wasn't a part of it. At the time when ecclesiastical history was written, Northumbria had gained the longest lasting existence as a Bretwald seen thus far. It has been previously assumed that the authority that Northumbria held over the other kingdoms during this period was loose or ceremonial or something, but this has been challenged. There's just a complete and utter lack of surviving evidence of anything from this period, so that's just an assumption more than anything else. In the last chapter, we saw that when Northumbria converted to Christianity with Oswald, then half of the country followed suit. The Church of Northumbria having the ability to bust into the werewolf worship party and bop everybody in the head with a Bible all the way in Wessex has to count for something. By the reign of King Oswy, the period's third and final ruler, the Northumbrians had the Picts and Scots as clients, every other kingdom recorded as calling him Lord, and a direct say on the religious fate of the nation, as we saw at the Synod of Whitby. Perhaps Northumbria really was the top dog, just running around and snatching chains like Debo from Friday and snarling at the lesser kings that they better see them at church this Sunday. But alas, after Oswy, the glory days came and went. When the late king passed, he was succeeded by his son Egfrith in 670. After scooching off to put down a couple rebellions by his brothers Alfrith and Aldfrith, Egfrith was able to get a firm grip on power. At first, it seemed like the age of Northumbria would continue without a hitch, as the Picts and other Celtic neighbors made a try at the kingdom but were swiftly stomped out. Then, in 674, Wulfhere of Mercia was like, I'm tired of Northumbrian prominence. Then he gathered an army that was a confederacy of all the southern kingdoms to finally stomp out the northern menace. And so, yeah, with all those bad boys teaming up, that was surely what brought the kingdom to its knees, right? All right, next. Nope, you jumped the gun, Wulfhere. Egfrith totally crushed the southern confederacy and put all the kids in timeout. How's this the end again? Well, according to the biography of Saint Wilfrid, Egfrith began to run out of luck when he allowed his evil wife to start influencing him, telling him to cut Wilfrid off. She was snaking around Egfrith's ear and saying stuff like, "Hey, don't you think Wilfrid is a bit corrupt? He sure does use his position of religious authority to gain a lot of material wealth. I mean, he was exiled from more than one kingdom, Are you sure it's good for our image to associate with him?" Another sneaky, silver-tongued, womanly naysaying, such as, "Hey, I know that Wilfrid said that you're obligated to grant him a sufficient amount of land, but his demands are ridiculous. He's using you, babe. There's no reason he should be granted more private land than what is usually chartered for our thanes. We need that land to construct more barracks. The Southerners were put down, but not for long. Wilfrid already has enough property for his ecclesiastical duties, and he moors a rapacious overreach that we can't afford." Yeah, this divorce from the noble and pure Saint Wilfrid was what started it all. Well, an increasingly ambitious Mercia is really what got the ball rolling, as they avenged their previous loss and soundly defeated Northumbria at the Battle of Trent in 679. Mercia was able to nab some concessions, but it wasn't the end of the world, as I'm sure Egfrith thought. Yeah, they won today, but they're not gonna push their advantage or anything. We still on top. Hey, that's life when you're at the top. You win some, you lose some. Northumbria forever. Yes. Right back to business. What do we got here? Another letter from Wilfred. This guy needs to shut up. Well, in 685, King Egfrith perished during a skirmish with the Picts in Scotland, and thus ended Northumbrian might. All right. Well, maybe now we can move on. What's wrong? You felt like you missed something? The kingdom reigned supreme for like 4 generations. So some guy named Glenn chucks a rock at Egfrith at a Saturday scrimmage and that's it? Like what on earth did the next ruler even do? Well, which ruler? The ruler that year or the ruler that sees the throne the next year? Or maybe the one that sees the throne 2 years from then, the week after that? Or maybe the one that sees the throne the week after that one? Following the Bretwaldas, we know that there were like 9 kings in Northumbria before one was able to hold on to the throne. So you're going to have to be a lot more specific. No Northumbrian glory fell because of the erosive poison that served as a ticking time bomb for the sovereignty of the very nation and culture of people we are narrating. Let's have a chat about the nature of Anglo-Saxon royalty and succession. Works like the poem Beowulf really put the spotlight on the instability of Anglo-Saxon politics. Kings were measured in their worth by their ability to grant gifts to their followers. The best way to gain golden treasure, and really the only way to gain it at the volume that a king's legitimacy demanded, was through the spoils of war. Therefore, war was perpetual and self-fueling. There was always going to be war, as the nature of royalty wasn't an inherent given. Rather, the ability to win battles were needed to constantly ensure a ruler's royalty. And well, that's because winning battles brought their followers gold. And if the king kept losing battles and the followers kept slumping home with no gold that night, well, looks like they needed to go find someone that was more royal than him. Besides, they kept losing. Why was the king still alive? Kings were required to fight on the front lines. Did you guys see him during the fight? I sure didn't. That loser was hiding. Let's go start a coup. During the period of dominance by Northumbria, it began and ended by their kings dying in battle. Oswald, the period's founder, and Egfrith, the period's closer. All the great wealth and prestige and lavish living of being the pinnacle of power for an entire nation of people didn't change a thing. In Anglo-Saxon England, whether you were an impoverished farmer drafted to protect your community, or the Bretwalda exchanging letters with the Pope, you lived by the sword and died by the sword. And there was never a single instance where a noble was taken hostage and became some kind of high-class prisoner in bargaining chip. No, none of that. The king was in the field lying lifeless next to his men. They were a warrior people through and through. While this culture made it so that Anglo-Saxon England was one of the most popular shopping grounds for mercenaries in the medieval world, as an Arab Silk Road merchant could just wave off his 2 Mercian nobleman rejects to go evaporate the desert's strongest bandits, it made little for stability. The fact that the country's leading ruler could just perish in a skirmish made the political order shaky by itself. But most cultures had their leaders at least present during combat, so this is not that crazy. But pair it with the succession system and all of a sudden it is. How succession law worked was that there was no succession law. Any male relative had a claim to the throne. And I'm talking about any of them. The last king's son, the last king's nephew, the last king's second cousin removed, the last king's second cousin remove's nephew. All of them had equal claim. This is why exiles were such a common chess piece in the country. A king's retinue consisted of a bunch of exiles from other kingdoms. Well, that's what's gonna happen if every time someone takes the throne, they have to exile like 100 dudes. Half or more of the historically relevant kings in this period came to power via usurpation out of exile. Each time the throne was vacated by a longtime holder, a bloody game of musical chairs ensued, until a fierce nobleman could finally grab the throne and crush the wannabes until nobody else thought it was worth it to try. But by the time this was finished, a lot of the times the kingdom was a weakened shell of its former self. This is why kingdoms rose and fell so quickly amongst the Heptarchy. In a later book out of 9th century Wessex called the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, no ruler is more than distantly related to the last throughout Wessex's dominance, and a good chunk of them came sword swinging out of exile. No father and son time here. And to compound it all tenfold, the new king didn't have to prove he was related to anyone. Kings would often claim lineage of centuries-old rulers, or distantly related people just long deceased that they couldn't confirm or deny. A real funny move was that sometimes the usurping king would claim the ancestry of the old pagan gods, Woden and Saxon, as these figures were repurposed after conversion into legendary founders of the royal dynasty. And if you were like, hey man, you're not related to Woden, neither was the last guy that you just stabbed, that he also said that. You don't have his signature blue eyes. I heard they were dreamy. Their response was, what does that matter? They had the most numerous and effective swords, so what are you gonna do? Deny it? None of the other nobles could stop him, so how could you? Soon the plague of marauding Gopniks that just mugged you with his crew, then turning around and becoming the king, got so bad that the church tried to step in. Church scholar Alcuin in 797 complained about it in a letter stating, more uncertain their origin, the more they lacked valor. And this was after the Legantine Council of 786, where it was decreed that kings were to be chosen by priests and the people, not to be had out of adultery or incest. Too little, too late. The practice already had centuries to entrench itself. Well, this makes for the funny observation that Anglo Saxon England had a wild amount of social mobility for the time. It's not sustainable. Every time a bit of a competent central administration took root, it blew away like a house of cards whenever a long-standing ruler keeled over. Gosh, these kingdoms are always internally fighting. They have no stability. Everybody has a claim to the throne. Man, if a big fleet of boats filled with their cousins from Denmark started crashing in, they were all united in their purpose of plundering this country, I wonder if the Heptarchy and all their history would survive. I'm sure they'll be fine. All right, well, that's going to do it for this episode. The next episode is going to be about Mercia and its time in the spotlight. It's short time in the spotlight, and then it's Wessex time. I've learned not to assume the scale because I always end up finding a bunch that I want to yap about. And then next thing you know, I gotta shut it down. So all I know is it's gonna be about Mercia. It's gonna start with Mercia. So what did you think? Did I get anything horrendously wrong? I respond to every comment, so don't be a stranger. Please, please, please like and also, if you're so inclined, I have a Patreon link below if you want to toss a couple coins into the jester's hat. All right, guys, hope you enjoyed. See you next time. Ciao.